The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
Picture the Florida Everglades. 150 miles of sawgrass, black water, and cypress shadows stretching out further than the eye can follow. For thousands of years, this was one of the most balanced ecosystems on the planet. Panthers hunted day, alligators ruled the water, raccoons raided nests, and bobcats kept the rabbits in check. It was messy, wild, and it worked. Then, sometime in the 1970s, something slipped into the swamp that didn't belong there. Not a hurricane, not a wildfire, a snake, a Burmese python, likely a released pet, quietly disappeared into the reeds. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. It was one snake in millions of acres of wilderness. What could possibly go wrong? Fast forward 5 decades, and that one snake has become an army. Wildlife officials now estimate that anywhere between 100,000 and possibly over 250,000 Burmese pythons are living, breeding, and feeding across South Florida. They are not small. Some stretch past 17 feet and weigh close to 200 pounds. And they've been eating their way through the Everglades so efficiently that entire species have nearly vanished. Raccoon and opossum sightings in python territory have dropped by around 99%. Bobcats are down by more than 80%. Foxes, marsh rabbits, and white-tailed deer aren't far behind. In some pockets of the park, researchers say the mammal population has effectively collapsed. So when the state of Florida stood up a few years ago and announced it was releasing thousands of creatures specifically designed to hunt these pythons down, people laughed. It sounded like something out of a bad monster movie. Fight snakes with more snakes. Send dogs into a swamp full of 18-foot predators. Turn loose an army of hunters chasing a creature that can vanish into wet grass a few feet away and never be seen again. It sounded absurd. Reporters mocked it. Late-night hosts joked about it. Even some biologists were skeptical. Nobody is laughing anymore, because the strange, almost science fiction plan that Florida rolled out did something nobody expected. It actually started working. And the story of how it worked, who is doing the hunting, and what may come next is stranger and more effective than anyone predicted. To understand why Florida had to get this creative, you need to understand how bad the problem actually became. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, places like Myanmar, Thailand, and parts of India and China, where the climate is warm, wet, and full of prey. In the 1970s and 80s, they became wildly popular in the American exotic pet trade. People bought them as hatchlings, not realizing that a 2-foot baby snake could grow into an 18-foot, 100-pound apex predator within a few years. Predictably, plenty of owners got in over their heads. Some pythons escaped. Others were deliberately released into the wild once they became too large or too expensive to feed. Then, in August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida as a catastrophic Category 5 storm. Among the buildings it destroyed was a python breeding facility near the Everglades. Hundreds of snakes were suddenly loose in the wetlands, all at once, in a landscape that turned out to be almost perfectly suited to them. South Florida's climate mirrors the python's home range closely enough that the snakes didn't just survive, they thrived. There was abundant prey, few natural predators, dense cover, and no biological competition. A female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs at a time. Do that math over decades, in an environment with almost nothing standing in their way, and you get exactly the population explosion Florida is dealing with today. Pythons are ambush predators. They are extraordinarily good at holding perfectly still, blending into marsh grass and leaf litter, and waiting. Wildlife researchers have said that even trained search teams walking directly through python habitat have less than a 1% chance of spotting a python that is actually there. Think about that. You could walk within a few feet of one of the most successful invasive predators in American history and never know it. And they are not picky eaters. Necropsies on captured pythons have turned up raccoons, opossums, bobcats, foxes, full-grown deer, wild boar, domestic cats, and even alligators. In one study, Researchers examined over 1,700 pythons and found the remains of dozens of species inside them, including threatened and endangered animals like the key lago woodrat and woodstocks. Roughly 1 in 4 pregnant female pythons captured in recent survey efforts were found to have eaten white-tailed deer. These aren't just predators. In the Everglades, they've effectively become the apex predator, sitting above alligators, panthers, and everything else that used to run the show. By the time officials fully grasped the scale of what they were facing, the population was already too large and too well hidden to remove through traditional means. You cannot trap what you cannot find. You cannot hunt what blends in perfectly with its surroundings. Florida needed a different kind of weapon, and that's where the creatures come in. Here's the part that sounds like fiction but is completely real. One of the most effective tools Florida has deployed against the python invasion is, ironically, other pythons. Researchers working with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida realized something important about python mating behavior. Male pythons are extremely good at tracking down females using scent trails, especially during mating season. So biologists began capturing male pythons, surgically implanting small radio transmitters inside them, and releasing them back into the wild. These are sometimes nicknamed scout snakes, because their entire purpose is to lead researchers straight to breeding females, and often straight into the middle of a nest. The strategy is brutally effective. Researchers follow the radio signal from a tagged male python during mating season, and it frequently leads them directly to a large, egg-bearing female, sometimes even before she's laid her clutch. Removing one pregnant female doesn't just remove one snake. It removes her and every egg she was about to lay, which can be anywhere from 50 to over 100 eggs in a single clutch. The results have been staggering. In one recent removal season, using a network of roughly 40 tracked male pythons, researchers pulled 177 pythons weighing a combined total of over 8,000 pounds out of a 200-square-mile stretch of Collier County alone, the largest single-season haul the program has ever recorded. The average pregnant female captured during these operations was carrying around 70 eggs. When you multiply that out across dozens of females caught in a single mating season, you start to understand why wildlife officials call this one of the most efficient tools they've ever developed. It's a strange, almost poetic irony. The python's own greatest evolutionary advantage, its keen sense of smell and drive to reproduce, has been turned into the very tool used to hunt it down. Nature didn't design a way to stop the python. Florida did, by using the python against itself. The Scout Snake program isn't the only strange tool in Florida's arsenal. The state has also enlisted a very different kind of creature, dogs. Working with programs like Auburn University's EcoDogs, and later with agencies including the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and the Miccosukee Tribe, researchers trained detection dogs to sniff out pythons hidden in dense vegetation. In controlled tests, these dogs actually outperformed human search teams at locating snakes in the same areas. A trained nose, it turns out, can pick up a python's scent trail in cover so thick that a trained human eye would walk straight past it. Beyond dogs, scientists have turned to environmental DNA, or EDNA, sampling water and soil for microscopic traces that pythons leave behind just by existing in an area: skin cells, waste, mucus. Even when no snake is seen, the DNA left behind can confirm a python was there recently, helping researchers map where to focus their limited resources. Infrared cameras, designed to pick up a python's heat signature against a cooler background, are also being tested in the field. And then there are the human hunters, which in a sense are the largest army of all. Florida runs 2 major contracted removal programs: the Python Elimination Program through the South Florida Water Management District, and the Python Action Team Removing Invasive Constrictors, run by the FWC. Together, they employ around 100 trained contractors who search public land specifically for pythons, paid an hourly rate that increases the longer they are out searching, plus bonuses tied to the size of each snake removed. Since the programs began, they've helped remove more than 17,000 pythons from Florida's public lands. On top of the paid contractors, Florida also opened the hunt to ordinary citizens through the now famous Florida Python Challenge, an annual competition where members of the public compete for cash prizes by locating and humanely removing as many pythons as they can in a set window of time. What started as a quirky publicity stunt has become a legitimate contributor to the removal effort and a way of keeping public attention focused on a problem most people never see. Because, as officials keep reminding everyone, the hardest part was never killing the pythons. It was finding them in the first place. The numbers tell the story of just how much this multi-front strategy has scaled up. From 2017 through 2024, removal numbers climbed to somewhere between 1,600 and 3,000 pythons per year. Then in 2025, something changed. Hunters removed more than 2,700 pythons in just the first 8 months of the year, matching an entire year's total in roughly two-thirds the time. In one particularly striking month, July of 2025, hunters removed 748 pythons in the Everglades alone, more than triple the number removed during the same month the year before. Officials say the state has poured roughly $2 million into these efforts, and for the first time, they are hitting population reduction goals well ahead of schedule. Even with dogs, drones, scout snakes, and hundreds of human hunters combined, officials are candid about one uncomfortable truth. They are not going to eliminate the Burmese python from Florida. Not fully. Not anymore. The population is too large, too spread out, and too good at hiding. Most experts now describe the goal differently. It isn't eradication. It's suppression. Keeping numbers low enough in critical areas that native wildlife has a fighting chance to recover. That's part of why researchers have also been quietly exploring a far more controversial idea in the background: biological control. The concept involves using a virus, parasite, or pathogen that specifically targets pythons without harming native wildlife, something that could work at a much larger scale than any dog, drone, or hunter ever could. It sounds almost too clean, too convenient. And that's exactly why scientists have been extremely cautious about it. Introducing a biological agent into an ecosystem is inherently risky. If the pathogen isn't perfectly selective, it can spill over into native species and cause a whole new disaster on top of the one you are trying to solve. For now, biocontrol remains a research question, not an active strategy, precisely because of how badly it could backfire if done carelessly. And in a genuinely strange twist, nature seems to have already tried this experiment on its own, with mixed and troubling results. Burmese pythons brought a hitchhiker with them from Asia, a lung parasite called Railiatella orientalis. Back home, pythons evolved alongside this parasite for so long that it barely affects them. But once it arrived in Florida, it jumped into native snake species that never developed any resistance to it, and the results have been far more lethal for them than for the pythons themselves. Researchers have documented native snakes suffering visible lesions, nodules, and worms emerging from their bodies as a result of the infection. It's a sobering real-world example of exactly the risk that keeps scientists cautious about deliberately engineering a biological weapon against pythons. Even an accidental one can spiral in directions nobody intended. So while a targeted, python-specific biocontrol agent remains a genuine long-term hope for researchers, the sheer difficulty and risk involved is precisely why Florida has leaned so heavily on the stranger, more hands-on approach already underway. Trained noses, tagged traitors, and boots on the ground. Go back and look at the headlines from a few years ago, and the tone is almost gleeful in its skepticism. Stories mock the idea of chasing an invisible predator through a swamp with dogs and radio tag snakes as a desperate, almost comedic last resort. Some commentators openly wondered whether Florida was just throwing money at a problem it had already lost. What critics underestimated was the sheer creativity and adaptability behind the approach. Every tool added to the arsenal, the scout snakes, the detector dogs, the Edna sampling, the paid contractor network, and the public hunting challenge, was designed to solve the exact same core problem. Pythons cannot be found using conventional methods. Instead of one silver bullet, Florida built an entire ecosystem of detection tools that compound on each other. A radio tag male leads researchers to a breeding female. A trained dog picks up a scent in cover too dense for a human. A water sample confirms a python passed through an area days earlier. A citizen hunter spots one crossing a low-V road during the annual challenge. None of these tools alone would solve the problem. Together, they are producing record-breaking removal numbers. The results have started speaking for themselves. Removal totals that used to hover in the low thousands annually are now on pace to be shattered. Individual removal seasons are pulling out record-breaking tonnage of snakes. A partnership with a leather goods company has even created an economic incentive loop, turning removed python skins into wallets, boots, and other goods, essentially building a market that helps fund the ongoing hunt. Professional hunters have relocated to Florida specifically to take part in what has become one of the most unusual and well-funded invasive species removal operations in the country. None of this means the fight is over. Officials are clear-eyed about that. The python population in South Florida is still almost certainly in the tens of thousands, if not more, and full eradication is likely impossible at this point. But the trajectory has shifted. What was once described as an unwinnable, invisible war is now, for the first time, showing real, measurable, and accelerating progress. Step back and look at the bigger picture, and the story becomes less about a single invasive snake and more about what happens when an ecosystem is pushed to the edge and fights its way back. The Everglades is one of the most unique wetland ecosystems on Earth, home to species found nowhere else on the planet. The near collapse of its mammal populations wasn't just a wildlife statistic. It represented a domino effect moving through an entire food web, from the smallest rodents all the way up to the panthers and alligators that depend on them. Every python removed, whether it's found by a radio tag scout snake, a detection dog, a research team following an Edna trail, or a weekend hunter competing in the annual challenge, is one less predator eating its way through a native population that has already lost the vast majority of its numbers. And there are early, cautious signs that some of these removal efforts are beginning to make a dent. Researchers are watching closely to see whether marsh rabbit, opossum, and other small mammal populations start to stabilize in the areas where python removal has been the most aggressive. The bigger lesson here may be less about pythons specifically and more about how devastating and unpredictable invasive species can be once they establish themselves in a new environment with no natural checks. What began as a handful of released pets in the 1970s and 80s became, within a few decades, one of the most destructive invasive species crises in American history, one that has already cost millions of dollars and consumed thousands of hours of research, hunting, and innovation, with no clean, final ending in sight. For now, the strange army Florida assembled, the traitor snakes wearing radio collars, the dogs with world-class noses, the water samples hunting for invisible traces of DNA, and the human hunters willing to wade into python territory for a paycheck or trophy, is doing something nobody thought was possible a few years ago. It's winning ground back, one hidden, camouflaged predator at a time. The people who laughed at the idea back then have gone quiet. Because whatever you want to call this strange, sprawling, multi-front operation, it isn't a joke anymore. It's one of the most inventive wildlife management programs in the country, born entirely out of necessity, and it's finally starting to work.